a new, softer look. Elena had her back to them, but they were able to see her shoulders drop as she released some built-up tension. Her stance went from one of tense isolation to relaxed expectation. Aside from these slight signs, neither girl nor horse moved, but George and Sally could feel the underlying current running between the two, a nonverbal communication that said so much more than words ever could. The two observers looked at each other, and with a silent communication of their own, moved away quietly toward the house, leaving the loners alone with their emotion. Looking carefully at this new two-legged, the stallion struggled with an intense knot of images and feelings that he was unfamiliar with. In his world, the unfamiliar could easily mean danger. He sniffed the air, looking for the scent of anything that might signal the need for flight, but the only familiar scents he could detect were that of the rain and the stronger smell of human presence, which was not at all new or surprising anymore. There was still confusion, however. This two-legged was female, and he could feel an intensity and excitement emanating from her that he had not felt from any other. Her presence brought vivid images of his mares, wilderness, and freedom to mind, instead of the strangeness and detachment that he had felt from other humans. He felt his muscles twitch with the memories of running free over the plains and through the trees. He could smell the wildflowers and the green mountain grass and the bubbling brooks of the old high country summer range. He waited. Elena was captivated. This poor emaciated stallion had been wild and free, just as she had. She could feel his wildness. Her heart pounded, and her shallow breathing quickened and deepened a bit as the stallion flicked his ears toward her and breathed sharply. For a moment she could see a change deep in his eyes. Through the cloudy dullness that had protected the depths of his feeling came a spark of light. As she watched, the spark grew to a small flame of what seemed like recognition. Elena and the stallion stood there, charged with electricity for what only seemed like a moment. A sudden whoosh directly overhead broke the spell. Elena looked up to see an owl settling into the tree above the stallion and realized that the sky had grown dark, the light drizzle was turning to a harder rain, and that more time had passed than she had thought. She could still feel the adrenaline running through her from the unexpected meeting, and she struggled to regain her composure as the stallion turned away. It's summertime. She's only been on the ranch a couple of weeks. The horse has only been there a day or two. And they get a monsoon rain. And they've just come home from doing the shopping in town. Sally pulled the truck in from the barn to the house, and she and George, amidst giggles and jokes, unloaded the groceries while Elena took care of the horses. As usual, she fed Hawk last, so if there was time left before dinner, she could spend it with him. Tonight, Hawk looked like a drowned rat. He was sopping wet, his mane and tail hanging like big hunks of the Spanish moss that hung in some of the trees. He had also rolled since the rain, and patches of him looked like wet adobe. Since his roan coat was wet and matted down, she could count his ribs, but he no longer looked like death. His hide was beginning to look more alive, filled out, hydrated like the earth after the rain. Weight gain was just a matter of time and patience, but it would come. Hawk didn't seem to mind being a walking mud bog. He really seemed quite pleased with himself. Looking at her through the long, damp forelock hair that hung down his face almost to his nostrils, he shook his head, sending water flying all around, and then snorted. Elena laughed as she carried his grain bucket in and set it down between them. He looked at her again and then stomped his foot, sending mud flying everywhere. Elena did not respond except to smile at him as he stomped again. Horse, Elena said, I am going to have to strip down to my underwear before Sally will let me into the house if you don't quit throwing mud on me. She stood her ground and he stood his, but not for very long. She finally averted her gaze from him to the bucket. He waited, watching for another minute or so, and then stepped up to get his grain. Snatching a mouthful, he jerked his head up out of the bucket quickly so that he could watch her, but he only stepped back a couple of steps. The sun was dropping faster toward the mesa top, and it was almost dark. The smell of dinner cooking floating out the back door teased her senses. She went back to the gate to get the pile of hay she had left there. She turned to carry it to one of the drier places under the owl tree, and was surprised and pleased to see Hawk's nose back in the grain bucket. As she moved to the tree with his hay, he jerked his head up, but this time he didn't move away. He just watched her carefully as he chewed. Elena had that feeling in her gut again, that feeling she had while George and Sally were dancing in the puddle. This time it rose to her chest and stayed there for a bit, warming her heart and then warming her all over. She put Hawk's hay down under the tree and then turned to look him in the eye, still feeling the warmth. They stood there like that, eyes fixed on each other. he with grain dribbling out the corners of his mouth as he chewed, she shivering a little in spite of the warmth building in her chest. His ears were up and alert, pointed toward her, and she was